Okay, let's start. Oh boy. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we just thank you again for the opportunity to come together and study from your word. And Father, give me your spirit to help me be able to articulate things in such a way. I know a lot of times these things can seem kind of dull and dry and lifeless, but Father, I need your spirit's blessing to breathe life into the things that we are studying here this afternoon. Thank you, dear Father. Amen. Last time I kind of went off track here, and Denise made a point of it. And so I kind of went off script, and that's another reason why I try to present word by word, not just so I can keep myself on track, but also so that afterwards you can come back and you can look at the things that we've gone over, because there's a lot of text that I don't go in and read it. I'll put the text there on the screen, but I don't necessarily have time to read through all the text. And so like David said, I can come through it from one angle, you may come to it from another angle, but what's important is that you take these things and you learn the truth for yourself. So if you're just simply listening to things that are said, I really don't feel you're going to really benefit that much for it. Hopefully what I'm saying will spark you to inspire you and motivate you to go find these things out for yourself, because there will come a time when we'll be asked to give a reason for the answer of the faith that's in us. Now, last time I went off script and I had mentioned I was trying to describe something in the sanctuary system, how that in both the earthly ministry and in the heavenly ministry, the atonement was at the center of both. And so that's what and so I know it's difficult to describe that in just words. So here I got this diagram. It's not my diagram, by the way. And of course, some of I went over it, and even though they don't have the right number of pillars surrounding the courtyard, the main point of it is you see these X's drawn through. The rest of it is to scale. And so when you draw an X through the earthly ministry, notice they're perfect squares, the earthly ministry and the heavenly ministry. And when you draw an X through those, the middle at the center, we see the atonement in each one. That's just what I want to do. So that was, rather than making Denise have to go back and redo that whole thing all over again and try to insert this slide in that point. If you were confused or you want to go back, and that was the reference there. Anyway, we're on part 4 of our Yom Kippur of Daniel 8:14, and hopefully you guys aren't getting too tired of this topic, but it's really hard to do justice to the 2300 days prophecy. And so this time, what I want to go over is this part can be kind of dry. It's calculating 1844 from the 2300 days, but I feel this is really important. And if somebody came to you and asked you, where in the world do you come up with 1844? Would you be able to open up the Bible and explain that to them? And I think that's important. So let's go with a brief review of what we looked at last time. So far, it's been set forth that the declaration for 2,300 days, then shall a sanctuary be cleansed, did not refer to the sanctuary of the earth to be cleansed by fire at the second coming, as the Millerites thought, but the sanctuary in heaven is to be cleansed by our all-powerful great high priest. Number 2, we learned that the gospel's wedding and the time of God's pre-Advent judgment began in 1844, and that's very important. Not only did God set the date of 1844, but in his sovereignty, he planned the great disappointment. And we asked ourselves the question, why did he do such a thing? And it was so that they and us, they referring to also not just the Millerites and us today, but also the disciples, that they would learn not to accept popular interpretations without sufficient scriptural support. Both groups, the disciples were disappointed and the Millerites. And they had to learn this lesson the hard way, that when you take popular interpretations of scripture, you're going to get all messed up, and it can lead to great disappointment.
Hey, Gordon.
Yes.
I know you've mentioned the Millerites many times, but during that time, wasn't there people coming from almost every church, and not just here in America, but around the world? People were like waking up to this idea that God was coming at that time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, in Sweden, I think it was Sweden, it was illegal. They actually had laws that the government shut down any discussion on this. And what happened was God's Spirit had to come upon little children, because the law didn't apply to little children. So he would have kids less than 10 years old preaching the sanctuary doctrine, the 1844, the coming of Christ. All that had to be proclaimed by little kids. So, and even in South America, there was a Catholic priest who grabbed hold of the 2300-day prophecy, and he was proclaiming the same thing that the Millerites said. So yes, you're right. It wasn't just here in America. The reason we focus on here in America, because it's only in here in America that really we have that small group who after the great disappointment went back and said, nah, there's something more to it. We know that the Holy Spirit was in this, and so we need to understand. And what they understood was that they had misunderstood the event, just like the disciples had understood the event. The timing was correct, but they had the event wrong. And so
I have a question.
Yes.
How could a Catholic priest figure out the 2300 days and still remain a Catholic priest?
He was actually proclaiming his thing under a pseudonym. That's how he did it. Number 5, God used time as a test to separate the genuinely earnest from the indifferent, and the steadfast from the persevering, from the wavering and the unconcerned. So a lot of people after the disappointment, a lot of them just left, and there was only left a small group. And so by using time as a test in 1843 and 1844, remember there was two dates that passed. God now had a small, tried and tested remnant through which he could work to restore the everlasting gospel in the spirit and power of Elijah, in order to gather from all nations the Israel of God out of Babylon's false gospels and doctrines. And unfortunately, so far the enemy has been successful in thwarting God's plan by spreading confusion and divisions in the ranks regarding the gospel and its application. For instance, earlier this week, I was listening to some YouTube videos on Adventists who've now joined the Catholic Church. And I'm saying, wow, they remind me of John's statement. They went out from us because they were never part of us. And then number 7, we looked at typology found in scripture that collaborated the certainty of an army to restore and proclaim the 3 angels' message. And so let's look at that typology in a little more detail. Actually, this is just a review of that typology. And it lays out a pattern that God used to test and select his army to carry out the 3 angels' messages. Gideon and his 300 foreshadowed the small army of believers God would choose to proclaim the 3 angels' messages. The first test determined who was afraid of the conflict of war and could be too easily discouraged by the odds. And so God just told them, hey, just let everybody who doesn't want to, be in the war, doesn't want to fight, let them go home. And he started off with 32,000. He's left with 10,000. So imagine how Gideon must have felt like, wow, hey. Huh. Anyway, but what did God's second and final separation test improve? It was a test of character. Those who prioritize their own needs in a time of crisis would look first to their own wisdom and resources to preserve themselves before waiting on God. Self-serving people are ill-prepared for team warfare ministry. So that was that test that God had given them, going down and to grab the water by their hands and rush on. What about the dream of the barley cake that tumbled into the camp? Gideon was, here he's got 300 and he's a little concerned. Wow, only 300. And so God knows he's afraid. God knows he's not so sure about this. And so God tells him, hey, go down to the camp and just, I want you to go down there and see something. So he goes down there, and this one guy tells this dream to his partner there. And he describes this barley cake just tumbling down into the camp. Now, I mean, this is quite a picture in this mind, this metaphor of a cupcake tumbling down a hill and smashing a big heavy, because those tents were made out of hides and stuff. It was a big heavy tent. Can you imagine a cupcake or a little, a slice of bread, mind you, smashing a tent? And all that mattered was how the guy interpreted it. And he understood it to mean that, well, yeah, it's highly unlikely that they would defeat us, but the fact that you dreamed that it would be a barley cake that smashes down a heavy tent means we are toast here. We're done for. And I was looking a little bit into this thing. I got kind of fascinated by the metaphor. I mean, how in the world would this guy come up with the idea that a cupcake would demolish everything? So barley was food for the poor. Its gluten content is also very poor, and because of that, it's easily broken into pieces. And no doubt it was probably unleavened because barley was like the first grain to harvest. So imagine here's this little piece of barley cake rolling down the hill, and as it's rolling, since it doesn't have very much gluten content, it's probably breaking up into crumbs, and it's probably a bunch of crumbs that actually hit the tent and just demolishes the tent. And then also you have the light from the broken pitchers. And we looked at that the excellency of the power of God may be of God and not from us. We looked at the scriptures that supported that idea. And so what's the overall message of going into battle with trumpets, clay jars, and torches? Not with spears. They didn't have any swords, just, trumpets, clay jars, and torches. And so give you some text there to look up and to point out that fact. Then we looked at another typological pattern for the three angels' messages in the book of Daniel. So we saw that there's three Hebrews who through faith in God refused to worship the image set up by Babylon, even though threatened with fire. They get thrown into a fire that's 7 times hotter, and they're joined by a fourth, who is the angel of the covenant. And I like that song, Kumi Ori. Now, what about the typology of Noah? Do you see any parallels there to the three angels' messages? What sticks out in my mind? He got 3 sons of Noah. Okay, 3 angels, 3 sons. Noah is a type of Christ. So you have 3 sons, you have a fourth, Noah being a type of Christ. Noah was also a preacher of righteousness. A day for a year prophecy there in Genesis 6:3 also. And the number 600 and the number 8 are patterns for the final judgment of the lost. In 2 Peter 3:4-9, immediately after using the flood as a pattern for the final judgment, he uses a day for 1,000 years for its timing. So you have 600, could be divisible by 6. You have all these patterns. 6,000 years, God has given 6,000 years for man to make up his mind to accept the good news of salvation. And on the 7,000th year, the earth will rest. That typology was presented again, and it work the land for 6 years and let it rest the 7th. And that, by the way, was the reason God sent them into Babylonian captivity, so that the land could have its rest, its Sabbath rest. So all these patterns just keep popping up over and over again. Now, you remember this on one of our studies, I think it was the 3rd one. Evangelical scholar Walter Martin wrote in his book, The Kingdom of the Cults. And by the way, most people look at Adventism as simply a cult. And he said, the Seventh-day Adventist doctrine of 1844 is the greatest faith-saving lie in the history of the Christian church. Then another scholar said, if Seventh-day Adventists cannot prove 1844 from the Bible, they have no right to exist as a denomination. And I would agree with that. And that's why we're looking at 1844 this time and see how we can calculate that date from the 2300-day prophecy. So, can the year 1844 be proven from the Bible? Well, the angel Gabriel was sent to Daniel to explain the time periods contained in the vision of the 2300 evening mornings. As always, context is very important. Now, the answer to the 2300 evening mornings is given by a certain Holy One in response to the questions asked by another Holy One. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will be the vision concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? Now, you'll see in italics, those words are supplied. And the reason they are supplied that way in this particular instance, because the translators had preconceived ideas, in my opinion. And we'll look in that in more detail. But it's a lot better if we remove the supplied words in the italics, and then we can see it a little more clearly. And it enables us to give us the right interpretation. How long the vision, the daily, and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. So how many questions are being asked? Anybody? And there's really no wrong answer to this. Yeah, it's really subjective, but I struggled. I came up with my answer, but what do you think? How many questions do you see there? I came up with 4 because I kind of put the 4th one kind of in the same thing, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be. So it's both the sanctuary and the host are trampled. So I kind of put that together, but you could put them differently.
What does it mean by the host? Going to the Catholic Church, they were talking about their host.
Okay, very good. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, well, it's definitely not that one, right?
No, it isn't. That's what they said.
Yeah, in fact, by doing that very host, they really are trampling the host. Every time a Catholic priest lifts up the host, he's actually trampling the host.
What do you mean by the Catholic host?
The host is the wafer that they give you, and you go up
the Eucharist.
And they call that the host.
To the reformers, it was blasphemous, the Eucharist. And why was that?
Because of transubstantiation?
Yes, transubstantiation. Does everybody know what that means? Go ahead, Eli. Tell us what transubstantiation is.
Well, they say that when they pray over the wine and the host, that it becomes the literal blood of Christ and the literal body of Christ. Therefore, you're actually consuming his blood and body. And there was so much arguments going on between that, whether Christ meant that figuratively or whether he meant that literally. And the Catholic Church is bound and determined to say that, no, you have to take the blood and body of Christ all the time in order to keep sanctified.
Yeah. It's a means of salvation. But why is that trampling the host, the real host? Who is the host? Remember as Israel entered in, they first came to Jericho. Remember when there was a man standing outside the city with his sword drawn? Who did he identify himself as? The captain of the host. But basically, yes, the reason it's so abominable, because if you say that the Catholic Church or a priest can, by his own authority, command Christ to become literally flesh and blood, you're actually asking him to die every time the Mass is said. And that is blasphemous, because he is offered once and for all. He ever lives to make intercession for us, not the priest. Okay. Now, the 4th one is mostly explaining the results of what the transgression of desolation does. The transgression of desolation tramples both the sanctuary and the host underfoot. So I kind of toyed, well, maybe it's really only 3, because really, the transgression of desolation is what's causing the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. But either way, the Hebrew word, or palmoni, translated certain, is used only here and nowhere else in the scriptures. In 1611 King James Version, it has a marginal note from the translators that reads, the number of secrets, or the wonderful numberer. Young's literal translation translates palmoni as wonderful number. Also, the literal standard version reads, and a certain holy one speaking, and a certain Holy One says to the wonderful numberer who is speaking, until when is the vision of the continual sacrifice and of the transgression an astonishment to make the treading down of both sanctuary and the host. So there we have a few translations also, but I wanted to see, well, can we get it if we don't have access maybe to those translations? Could we find somewhere else in the Bible? So I was looking for some words here. It said in Isaiah 9:6, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So since the vision's focus is on judgment, would it be logical to assume that the wonderful number is also the judge? And is he connected with other judgments? And that's why I say it's important to look at context. Now, the book of Judges gives an account of this wonderful judge in Judges 13, 17, and 18. And it reads, then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, what is your name? That when your words come to pass, we may honor you. And the angel of the Lord said to him, why do you ask me my name, seeing it is wonderful? And in the book of Daniel, we see the hand of the wonderful numberer passing judgment on Babylon, its king, and its 1,000 lords. So from his presence, the hand was sent. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. So when I take these different passages and put them together, the words translated wonderful, Pele, and Mene, Aramaic meaning numbered, are apparently combined to form the contracted term title Palmoni, the wonderful number. Mene is also descriptive of a weight of measurement, according to Strong's. So at death, Egyptians believed Osiris weighed their deeds in a literal balance scale. So Babylonians, they probably believed a similar thing, which explains why the Palmoni was used in this metaphor. But it also demonstrates this truth. And remember, before Daniel interpreted the handwriting on the wall by Palmoni's finger, he rehearsed the history of his grandfather and rehearsed the history how his grandfather exalted himself. One day, Daniel warned him, he says, look, this is what you need to do. Give God glory. And so he obeyed that until about a year later, he walks out on his deck and he looks over Babylon and he says, is this not great Babylon, which I have created by my own hand for my glory? And immediately the voice came down from heaven, cut down the tree.
Exactly when he.
And so his self-exalting, giving glory to himself, and this has a typological pattern to Revelation, shows you how subtle, and he became a literal beast, shows you how subtle receiving the mark of the beast can be. It is simply taking glory to yourself rather than giving glory to God, which is what the first angel's message is. Fear God, give glory to him, and worship the Creator. Don't worship your own works by your own hands. Don't give credit to yourself and your own salvation. And so, and it also demonstrates that although they knew God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these things, these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And that's why God has put in everyone's mind, even the evolution, even the atheists, everybody has this inner wisdom. They know in their deepest heart of hearts, they know God has placed that in everybody, but they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And that's why God delivers them up. See, God's righteousness, his wrath is being revealed from heaven right now at this very moment as we speak. And how is it being revealed? Well, if you continue to read Romans, first chapter, and going in even into the second chapter, he delivers people up. That's what he does. You don't want to acknowledge God? He says, fine. It's a hands-off approach, and we're delivered up to all of our own devices. And we see that in our world today, the results of that. For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment, also because he is the Son of Man. So the wonderful number numbered off the 2,300 days of atonement to notify the world when his hour of judgment had begun. This was his answer to the questions of how long would these things seen in the vision be permitted to continue. The transgression would continue until the final phase of his high priestly work was finished. With the blood of his finished work of atonement on the cross, he began his work of cleansing the sanctuary in heaven of confessed sin, while at the same time cleansing those who by faith follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And just as in the earthly sanctuary system, on the Day of Atonement, those who refuse to afflict their souls and by faith confess their sins would see their sins go into the sanctuary. They would by faith follow the high priest into the most holy place for that work of atonement, that blotting out of sins, so that they, when he would come out, they could receive the blessing. Okay, let me continue. Then when he is finished cleansing both the sanctuary in heaven and his bride on earth, the marriage will have come on earth as it is in heaven, because the bride will be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Those whose garments are spotted with the flesh will be cast out of the wedding chamber, or Christ, because Christ is the wedding chamber, just as he's the door, just as he's the sanctuary, just as he's the light of the world, just as he's the lamb, just as he's the altar, just as he's the incense, just as he's the priest himself. It's all there, taught through the sanctuary system. It's taught in Noah's Ark. Enter into the ark. The ark represents Christ. These are the events that occur during the days just before the angel of the covenant blows the seventh trumpet, when the mystery of God will be finished, as he has declared to his servants, the prophets. And we looked at that in one of our previous studies in more detail, but we won't go into that because we're trying to calculate the date here. So back to the question, how long is the vision? That's the question we want to answer this afternoon. So the New Living Translation reads, how long will the events of this vision last? So since the vision started with the ram with two horns, which represented Media and Persia, we can rule out the preterist interpretation that the 2,300 days are to be understood as regular days, which is 6 years, 140 days, which they say have already been fulfilled by the Maccabean revolt, when they defeated the forces of Antiochus IV and rededicated the temple. And incidentally, a lot of them fail to realize that interpretation was developed by a Jesuit Catholic priest in the Counter-Reformation to get the papacy out of the hot water, because the reformers had identified the papacy as the Antichrist with Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8, and also in Revelation 13. But since the vision began with Persia, 6.5 years would have expired before the Greek Empire even emerged. Also, it contradicts Gabriel's interpretation of when to begin counting the days. In a previous study, Jesus and Hanukkah, Gabriel referenced the people of the Maccabean uprising in Daniel 11 almost as a side note, and then said that they would exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they would stumble and fall. But more importantly, it contradicts Jesus' interpretation in Matthew 24:15, where he says, when the abomination of desolation would culminate in the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. Remember, he said, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, that's when you are not to even go back to grab your coat, and to pray that your flight will not be on the Sabbath or in the winter. So calculating the days as 2,300 years can be done by assigning a day for a prophetic year, as in Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4, 5, and 6, which Adventists traditionally do. And that's That's fine. You can do that. But I think there's a better way. And we'll look at that next time, because doing it just simply as a regular day and then change it to a year we'll look at that last time and show you how there's a better way. The word translated days are evening, mornings, and that's important, as in 24-hour periods. Considering the vision's ram and goat imagery used to make atonement on Yom Kippur, along with the words cut off, because that was what would happen on the Day of Atonement. If you didn't afflict your soul, you would be cut off. That word's also used on Yom Kippur, would allow the literal days to be understood as Yom Kippur days. This becomes an important defense against miscalculating the time periods. The vision's context is centered on the timing of the atonement and its application. The how long questions concerning the daily, the abomination that desolates, the trampling of both the sanctuary and the host, assume a time when the atonement would rectify the negative situations that's brought about by the little horn's transgression. So are you following here? Somebody said no. Okay, the whole vision. Now remember, in all the previous visions, the kingdoms that Daniel went through in Daniel chapter 7, they were unclean beasts. But now when he gets to this vision in Daniel 8, he goes over the same time periods, but this time he uses rams and goats, and those are clean beasts, and they're used on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. And so when he says 2,000 evenings and mornings, he wants you to understand them as literal 24-hour periods, but they can be understood as literal days, or they can be understood as years if you only understand them as Yom Kippur years. In other words, 2,300 Yom Kippur days gives you 2,300 years. So we have the 2,300 years, yes. So let's continue. And then next time we'll look at why understanding them as 24-hour periods is important, because those who come up with counter interpretations, it's not actually a literal 24-hour period. And we'll look at that next time. Gabriel tells us at what point in time to start numbering the 490 days. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. So now Gabriel declares that the starting point for the timeline of the vision is from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem. Since the vision begins with Persia, it's expected that the decree would be issued by Persia and recorded by Ezra the scribe. So the book of Ezra contains 3 decrees. Here again is another pattern that points to the certainty of the 3 angels' message. The 2,300-day vision begins with a 3-fold decree commanded by God. 1844, in the same way, ends with a command by God in Revelation 10:1 to prophesy 11 to prophesy again a 3-fold message. The 3rd command was a blank check. You can look that up. We don't have time to look that up in detail now. Was issued in 457 BC. And incidentally, the others who come up with a different date, they acknowledge that 457 is an accurate date. They just don't want that one. Gabriel's starting point of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem necessarily had to include all 3 decrees, which were themselves commanded by God. And so let's look at that. And they built and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the command of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. So all 3 decrees are important. So the question comes, well, which one do you choose then? 77s are determined for your people and for your holy city. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So we know that there's 77s, which is 490 days or years, but we're looking at days at this point, or year, it doesn't matter. Are hatak, that is cut off, or determined from the whole 2,300. So you take the whole 2,300, and Gabriel's saying, look, this is for your people and for your holy city. We're going to take these first sections, we're going to cut them off. That's for you. That's for you to determine, or for you to, your people. So you take 2,300 and you subtract 490, it gives you 1,810 left, right? Then you take that 490, you subtract from 457 BC, and it gives you 33. But you have to add a year to move from BC to AD, so you come up with AD 34. So remember the very first, when we subtracted 490, we were left with 1810. That's where we get that. So 34 plus 1,810 gives us 1844. And so you see how simple it is to come up with 1844. It's so simple, so easy. Okay, 7 weeks plus 62 weeks. We'll add a little detail. It's important that we're looking at the atonement here, because remember, there's the atonement and there's the application of the atonement. And evangelicals, typical Sunday keeping Christians, don't see the distinction. They say the atonement was finished at the cross. And that's true, isn't it? The atonement was finished and done. When Christ hung on the cross, he cried out, "It is finished." There's not going to be another sacrifice. It was done. It's complete. It's finished. But that wasn't on the Day of Atonement that he did that. The Day of Atonement comes later. And that's why, even though the atonement was finished, the atonement has to be applied. Satan is still alive and well. The scapegoat is still alive and well, okay? He hasn't yet been led into the wilderness to perish, okay? So that's why there is an application of the Day of Atonement. And unfortunately, Christians have said, well, all that stuff's old Jewish stuff, that sanctuary stuff, that's all in the past, that's been done away with, and we don't need that anymore. No, we still need the sanctuary doctrine of what it teaches to understand the plan of salvation, because it's a complete system of truth. And the way to check it, if we have the plan of salvation correct, is to measure it against our understanding of the sanctuary. So 7 weeks plus 62 equals 69 weeks, times 7 days equals 483 days. And so 483 days minus 457 will take us to 26 AD, but then we have to add the year again to cross over from BC to AD, and we come up with 28.7 AD. So that's how we get from the 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That's how you get to Messiah the Prince. And Messiah the Prince, or the Prince, the anointed Prince, he was anointed when? At his baptism. So that's how you get to his baptism. And then we came up, look up above, it ended, the 70 weeks ends in 34 AD. That's the end of the 70th week. So the 70th week immediately follows the 69th, or it is no longer the 70th week. Therefore, the 70th week is from 27 AD to 34 AD. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Then he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. You remember the curtain between the holy place and the most holy place was rent from top to bottom. So why choose the third decree Artaxerxes issued and not the first or the second decree? So the date for the first decree would make the 69 weeks or 483 years terminate too early for the baptism of Christ. Cyrus issued the first decree in 538 or 537 BC, if we, once we convert it. The first year of his reign, Ezra 1:1, which would put his baptism in 54 BC, way too early, okay? And his birth in 81 BC, and nobody would agree to that. So nobody accepts that date, okay? Then Darius confirmed the first decree and added the second decree in Ezra 6:1-12. But in the second decree, a date is not even mentioned. But the third decree issued in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, is very detailed. And we can look at that. It says, Ezra arrived on the first day of the 5th month of the 7th year of the king's reign, very down to the month, even to the day. This detailed decree is referenced 3 times. The decree provided for future expenses and setting up of the city government, its ruins and walls, and whatever is commanded by the God of heaven, as seen in Ezra 7:23 and also Ezra 9:9. Others use the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which is 440 BC, as a start date. And they get that in Nehemiah 2:1. And that is a valid date if you want to use that date that's found in Nehemiah 2:1-9. But we don't use it. And next time we'll look in more detail about why we don't use it and why they use it. But this was not the decree. It was not a decree, but unrecorded letters of authorization for passage and for more materials requested by Nehemiah, which was provided for under Artaxerxes' original decree. And what matters is what Ezra understood the decree to mean in Ezra 9:9. When you get a chance, you should look at that, Ezra 9:9, because he understood it to mean basically a blank check and we're to build everything, the city, the walls, everything. So why choose 457? Now this is interesting. Now the Millerites, they used Ptolemy's canon to match the dating of the kings with today's calendar. In other words, you got to set aside that ancient form of dating of the reign of kings, and you have to lay it alongside of the Julian calendar to come up with the date. So there's a book by Richard Parker and Waldo Duberstein, however you pronounce it, called Babylonian Chronology, 626 BC to AD 75. And they really went through this stuff with a fine-tooth comb. So their method compares thousands of tablets dated by their authors and takes the closest starting date and ending date of the reigns of different kings, with some as accurate as the very day. So to align the dates with BC dating, they used the eclipses recorded on the tablets, which was very important to pagan cultures. One tablet even predicted a future eclipse to occur on the 7th year of Cambyses. Now Xerxes, in Ezra's book, the predecessor of Artaxerxes, was murdered sometime between December 17, 465 BC, and January 3, 464 BC. That's what this book kind of entails, and you find out and everything. Now, the latest tablet date for his reign is dated month 9 of the 21st year of his reign, which aligns with December. Then the Elephantine Papyri from Egypt also records the date. Artaxerxes began to reign, aligning with our January 3, 464 BC. Now, most scholars believe that Xerxes died before the end of December, and the news of his death didn't reach Egypt until January. And so that's why we can count from the very beginning. The first year of his reign began in 464 BC. And that's how we come up with the date, 464 BC minus 7 years, because that was the 3rd decree was issued in the 7th year, and that's how you come up with 457 BC. Why did the Millerites choose October 22 and not September 23? This is another opposition that we get. Which was the day the Jews observed the Day of Atonement in that year according to the rabbinic calendar. Now, the Millerites believed the Karaite calendar to be more biblically accurate and chose the old Karaite Jewish calendar. And there's an article in the Signs of the Times back then, dated June 21, 1843, it states, now there is a dispute between the rabbinical and the Karaite Jews as to the correct time of commencing the year. The former are scattered all over the world and cannot observe the time of the ripening of that barley harvest in Judea. They therefore regulate the commencement of the year by astronomical calculations and commence with the first day of the new moon nearest the vernal equinox, when the sun is in Aries. The Karaite Jews, on the contrary, still adhere to the letter of the Mosaic law and commence with the new moon nearest the barley harvest in Judea, and which is 1 month later than a rabbinical year. And so that's why the Millerites chose October 22, 1844, because they believed, look, if we're going to go by the Bible, let's stick with the Bible's reckoning of months. And that's why they went that year with the Jewish Karaite calendar. So the rabbinic calendar began in the 4th century under Hillel II and the rabbinical court. And the reason they came up with that, because they recognized that, hey, this counting the months by Abib, it's just not going to work. We're scattered all over the place. So that's why they came up with that, decided to switch to a different calendar. So next time, we're going to look at denying the prince and embracing Antichrist. We're going to look at the biggest blunder in the history of Christianity. It is the biggest blunder in Christianity, and it has to do with this 2,300 days. We're going to look at counterfeiting the Advent movement of 1844, preterism and futurism. Well, we're not going to look at preterism idea because it's so flimsy and so, we briefly just stated it, but just mention it in passing. But we'll look in further detail into futurism. We'll look at counterfeiting the 70 weeks of probation for the nation of Israel, because they do counterfeit the 70-week prophecy. And why do futurists use 444 BC instead of 457 BC? Where do Christians get a 7-year tribulation? And what are the counterfeits of the wedding and the pre-Advent judgment?